So today we're gonna talk about the Gospels a little more. I wanted to sit in those some more because this class, the 12 classes of the whole program, don't have anything specifically focused on Gospels. And I've been like, man, I wonder if we should do something about that. So this is me kind of doing something about that. But then we're going to get into Paul's life and his timeline as a framework for understanding the Pauline corpus of 13 epistles. And I include Hebrews in that because no one knows who wrote it. Could have been Paul. It probably was Paul. But we don't know. So we'll just say 13 just because it's fun. So we'll do that. And then we're going to go through those epistles one by one. And then we'll do the general epistles. So the general epistles is a way of saying the other letters. Just kind of throw them in a group. And then that'll be that. That'll be our class. Does that sound good? Over the next, today and then 3 more weeks. And then we'll do biblical theology. We'll take 2 weeks off, then do biblical theology and finish. We'll finish by Thanksgiving. Good morning. So last week, we talked through the 4 Gospels, and I wanted to retrace that and just kind of use the Socratic method. So I wanted to let you know a little bit about me before I do that. Why use the Socratic method as a teacher? So this is a fun story. I was at Franklin High, 10th grade. How old are you? What is it? 15 years old. And you had to pick someone from history to do a research paper on. My teacher was Bonita Swan Davis. That was her real name. She was phenomenal, by the way. I didn't know it, but at Franklin High, to have kids write a 20-page research paper when they're a sophomore in high school is unusual. But she chose to do that. And it wasn't honors. It was just regular sophomore English paper. So I showed up a little later than everyone else at the library where we were going to kind of stand in a line. First come, first serve. You just walk up to Bonita Swan Davis and tell her who you've chosen to study. And I wanted Martin Luther because he's the Protestant reformer. But Russ Runyon took Martin Luther because he showed up on time. So I had no backup option, and I was dumbfounded. And Bonita said, how about Socrates? And I said, Whocrates? I had no idea who Socrates was, but she basically just assigned him to me, which was a gift. And it was actually trajectory setting for me in my life, believe it or not. I remember studying Socrates that year and kind of going deep into research. Also, I think it was my first panic attack when I sat down to write that paper. I had like 200 note cards and no idea how to write a paper. And that anxiety was actually that I knew I cared about it and could be good at it, but I didn't know what to do. That's why I was anxious, is because it was actually a sign of a gift for writing that was unrealized and potential. As I journeyed through understanding Socrates, one of the first philosophers in history, I realized that I cared about thinking and critical thinking. And also, he had a dose of humility for me that I have still yet to realize, which the Delphic oracle said that he was the wisest man alive. And it was because he said he knew nothing. So that should tell you something. The more you know, the more you really don't know. It's like, what? It's just true. Even in science, the more you know. My wife's literally a rocket scientist, and she says the higher up you go, the less you actually know. Which should only be humbling, not discouraging. It's an invitation into the mystery of God and what he's created, where you can both know and not know at the same time. And I think as Christians, that humility is really important. Again, I'm still seeking after that humility. So let's, by way of Socratic method this morning, let's talk about what we learned last week. Who was Matthew written for? What was the audience of Matthew? Generally speaking, it doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of generally speaking. Jews, yeah, okay. Not just Jews, but who? What kind of Jews? What was it? Yeah, Jewish converts to Christianity. And how do we know that? How do we know that that was his audience? Just kind of, again, a simple answer. And there's a handful of answers.
I wasn't here last week.
You can cheat, use your notes, yeah?
He does explain Jewish law and
Okay.
processes.
He doesn't explain certain Jewish laws. He kind of assumes them. Okay, what else? What are some signposts in Matthew?
Wasn't the Hebrew language one of them?
Yeah, so second century tradition says that a couple sources say that he wrote it in Hebrew originally. We don't have any of those copies. What else?
I don't know if it connects to the Christianity part, but you had mentioned the term Son of Man was in there like 30 times.
Yeah, 30 times, and Son of God is only 8 times. And why does that make it more Jewish? Yes, Daniel 7. Basically, it's a Jewish notion that doesn't make sense outside of that. Okay, what else? A couple more.
Kingdom of heaven versus kingdom of God.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's not as clear to me. Maybe, yeah, how would that make it more Jewish?
Forget.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't, that may not be a strong one. I'd have to think more on it to really connect.
Well, maybe because it appeals to what they have been hoping for.
I'm talking about cookies on the lower shelf here. Okay, these answers should be a little easier.
Broken up in 5 discourses.
5 discourses to match the 5 books of the Torah. Okay, yeah. What else? There's maybe one more.
I've got it written down. Jesus is the authentic king of God's righteous nation. So we're positioning it in their thought of the Messiah.
Yeah, I think so. More of that, and also he opens with the Jewish genealogy. I think that's probably the lowest shelf. I'm trying to give you some things to grab onto as you think, just even casually think about it. It's like at face value, how can we gather some of this? Okay, so that's Matthew was written for a Jewish Christian audience. Who was Mark written for? Who did I say he was written for? Gentile Christians, okay. And what are some reasons we can, or some anchors we can put in that supposition? How do we know that?
He would translate a lot of the words that Jesus said.
Can anyone think of one word?
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani.
Okay. Another word? Another phrase?
Right?
I went to a Christian college.
Yeah, Talitha Kum. So he was helping those who didn't know Aramaic and who knew Greek. What else? Who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Yeah, John Mark. Okay. And who did he get his information from? Because he was not an apostle. Peter. And who was Peter? What was his mission in life? Who was he the apostle to? The Gentiles. That's why the Gospel of Mark is written to Gentiles. Because that was his calling. That was Peter's calling. Through Mark, it comes out. Also, we skip the genealogy in Mark because it doesn't matter as much, apparently, for that context. Luke, who was Luke written for? Yeah, that's a good answer. What does Theophilus mean? Do you guys remember this? If you took Acts class. I might have misspelled it, but Theo means what? God. Phyllis means, yeah, lover of God. So that's who it was literally written to. I tend to think that because of the Gentile inclusion emphasis in Luke and Acts, that you could say Matthew was written for Jews, Mark was written for Gentiles, and Luke was written for both. Kind of the mix. That's one way to think about it, and I think there's merit to that. Who was Luke's source for his gospel? Paul helped more with Acts. Yeah, he could have helped with Luke, but he wasn't there as much. What was his source for Luke? What could we guess from what he says in Acts? He sat down and what did he do? How did he get his source material from his own words? Yeah, we'll just read it together. Acts 1. So this is, again, Acts and Luke overlap a little bit if you read the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts together. So he says, in my first book I told you about everything that Jesus began to do and teach. Where does he say it? Where does he say... Does anyone remember where he says, like, how he got his gospel? Let's see. Yeah, okay, it's actually at the beginning of Luke. Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They use the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain. So he basically did his research. Legitimate research, but I think he was more of a synthesizer. Okay? And who wrote John? John, okay. And who was John?
Disciple of Polycarp.
So, yeah, Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. And John was an apostle. That's right. He leaned upon the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper. Who did he write for? He wrote for the BBC World News. Yeah, Asian converts. So he was located in Ephesus in the 90s. And that's when currently I think he wrote the gospel in the 90s. But if it was then that's what the tradition has. He was in Western modern day Turkey, and he wrote for the people there. Now, if you know what Ephesus was like back then, it was this metropolitan city, coastal city, commerce, politics, religion, all intersected there. It was very spiritual. That's why in the book of Ephesians, and then in the anecdotes Luke has in Acts, it talks about, witches or whatever you want to call it, spiritists. Very spiritual. So that's why Paul writes that way. So when you read John, you're really reading a spiritual gospel. And I believe by the 90s AD, Gnosticism had taken root in different ways, mixed with some of the philosophies of the day. And I think that John is addressing them. The deeper I go into John, the more I believe that he was not only aware. Some people call it proto-Gnosticism, like early. I just think it was Gnosticism. In fact, the first Gnostic is, what was his name? Was it Philippi? I'll think of it, but it's actually someone mentioned in the gospel in Acts. It's going to bother me, but anyway. So I think John was addressing very deep and rich philosophy and theology. So I call it the spiritual gospel. He sat down with there's actually a new book that came out that supports this, but it's pretty clear. There's no reason to doubt that he sat down with the three synoptic gospels and said, what can I add here? And so he made a more orderly account and a spiritual gospel. So, which gospel should you start with when you're discipling people? Growing up, I always heard John.
It's too long. I like Mark.
These days, I lean towards Mark because it's not Jewish and we're Gentiles primarily. Let's say you are talking to a Jew, though, like an actual Jew. I would do Matthew. I lean towards Mark because it's short, it's Gentile focused, and it's to the point. I would not start with John. I think John is, like Origen said, the first fruits of the Gospels. Like, this is the cream of the crop, and sometimes people are not ready for filet mignon, and they'll spit it out because it doesn't make sense to them, and they waste filet mignon. I think you gotta sometimes give them milk, you know what I'm saying? I actually might not even start with Mark. I don't know, but that's for you to spiritually discern. I just wanted to give you some ideas as you process that. I've also thought, man, if they don't know the Old Testament, the Messiah is not going to make any sense. But if they read the Old Testament, it's going to take a long time. So how do you do it? Wait for biblical theology next class, and I'll tell you more on that. So that's our review of the Gospels. Now I want to do some reading of the gospel to apply what we're talking about. I was advocating for turning the dial down on a historical approach. Again, a valid and helpful approach. And turning the dial up on a theological approach. And the reason for that is not just what people did after the Gospels were written in church history, but because the Gospels themselves were doing theology. Now, they were historical. We just read that from Luke. But the point is not to just give you the facts. The point is transformation. And that's the word. The word we use for that is theology. Theo, logos, very similar to, okay? Theology is God reasoning. And the Gospels are prime for that because who is the Logos? It's Christ himself. John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. So by studying the Gospels, we're doing the richest theology. So when you open the Gospels, don't just read history. That's elementary. It's good, but it's elementary. They want to lead you to God through the Logos, and that's why a theological approach is helpful. But how do we read the Gospels together? We've got 4, so let's say you pick one. Well, how do you preach and teach the Gospels? Because we've got 4. So let's say you pick what's called a pericope. That's a fancy word that we can use in this class. Pericope, which I spelled periscope in college. I was trying to be smart. Pericope is basically just like one segment or one story. Okay, so if you read that in a book, if you add an S there, it's periscope. So it was funny though, looking back. Let's say you're preaching on a pericope, which is a good way, or you're teaching the youth on a pericope from the Gospels. And it's also in 2 other Gospels. What do I do? Which one do I pick? And there's some differences too. Not contradictions, but differences, like we've been talking about a little bit. So do you try and blend them together? How do you blend them together? What do you do? That's an important practical question. So I want to advocate for a certain way of reading the Gospels symphonically. Okay? So we can read the Gospels harmonically, and this is what I was taught. I don't think it's wrong inherently, but I don't think it's full. So harmonically means you read the Gospels at the same time, blending them together so that you can hear it as one. The emphasis for a harmonic reading of the Gospels is sameness. Okay? And this is not without cause, because the gospel is one. A lot of translations, let's see if these have it here. They start with, and the actual title in the manuscripts is The Gospel According to Luke. Not Luke's Gospel. There's a difference there. There's only one gospel, but there's different tellings. Okay? However, if you read symphonically, the emphasis in that is on the uniqueness of each intonation, each account. And you hear it on its own right. So, but it sounds like you're putting them together, and that is true. They do go together. So the question is not, do they go together? It's how. When you read symphonically, at first you hear each of them distinctly instead of as one at the same time, virtually indistinguishable, but kind of a whole. Harmony is hard to distinguish between the parts. Symphonically, you can point out what the different parts are. So at first you hear them distinctly because you're learning to play the instruments. And then you step back and you can hear them play as one. And the emphasis here is the difference within unity. So I was listening to Forrest Frank's song with Joshua a couple days ago. And he said, did you hear the guy go, "Rrr"? And I was like, what? Joshua is very attentive to detail. I rewound it, and there's a line in this Forrest Frank song. I'm trying to remember which one it was. But it says, like, something about anger, and in the background, one guy goes, "Rrr." Like, that's it. And Joshua heard that, and I was like, dang, dude. That's awesome. When you listen to a symphony, especially if you can watch it visually, you know when the woodwinds come in, when the brass, you know when the timpani sounds. You can hear the trumpet distinctly, and you can hear the violins, okay, and the cello. I want to advocate for a symphonic reading because it's richer and it respects the individual accounts more. So there's a book by a man named Gundry. I forget his first name, but it's a brown book, and it takes the 4 Gospels and it puts them all together based on pericope, and it lays out in columns the stories next to each other. Has anyone seen this? Does anyone have it? It's pretty cool. If you ever want to like just understand the differences, it's amazing. They actually break it up into the different lines. And that's how I was trained. And again, I don't think it's like wrong or bad, but I do think it's deficient and not optimal for what we really should be doing. So practically, what does this mean? And why do we do this? I think it's difficult and unnecessarily confusing in preaching and teaching to read harmonically. What are you going to do, stand up and be like, well, but in Luke there was 2 angels? And it's like, no one cares, okay? And it's distracting. When you preach, for example, you want it to be like for encouragement and build-up. When you teach, you know, it's like, what's your point in bringing that out? Dealing apologetically, okay. So it should be one tool in your tool belt. But if every tool you have is a hammer, it's like, Brad, I'm thinking about you, man. Why should we read symphonically? Historically, this is how it was done. In fact, there is an early harmony of the Gospels by Tatian called the Dia Tessaron. Dia means through in Greek, and Tessaron means 4. And so he tried to do a harmonic reading and actually published this book. And it was actually condemned as heterodox. Like, don't do that. I'm not sure all the reasons, but that's one nugget for you to just keep in mind, that there is a historical precedent for not reading harmonically. Literarily and theologically, I think there's a reason to do this. It respects the gospel narratives as they were written. And it helps you to hear them on their own terms for their unique contribution to the story, because there are differences, and those can be good. Okay, it's like you think about your children, right? If you have kids, you don't want them to just be like, you know, the Smiths. It's like the Smith girls. No, like it's Skylar and Sailor, right? Like they're individuals, and they feel respected, especially as they grow up and understand what I'm talking about, for their individuality. And I think that there's a reason God made 4. That's maybe another way to think about it. Why did God not just write 1 through the witnesses? So I think it's a respectful way to listen on their own terms. So practically speaking, when you're preaching or teaching or discipling someone, pick one and just stick with it. Don't make it more complicated than you need to. In fact, resist the urge to bring in the other gospels in a specific instance. Again, you can do that, but what I want you to do is be trained by a symphonic reading first, over years, maybe a decade or more, before you can feel more comfortable doing a harmonious approach. Again, not wrong, not bad to do that. I'm just saying, start by that discipline. It's simpler, it's less confusing, and I think there's a good precedent for it. So let's do an example. Let's think about the crucifixion and read some of that. Does that sound good?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Matthew, is it 19? Nope, we're much further than that, 26. Yeah. And so I'm going to push some of the limits of my ability to teach this morning. I don't have this preconceived. This is spontaneous to go through the crucifixion. We might do the resurrection as well. So we're just going to play a little bit. How can we read Matthew's crucifixion story of the one true story and really just hear what he's saying? When Jesus had finished saying all these things, okay. You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified, Jesus said. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the place of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. It's very Jewish, isn't it? The language is Jewish. Chris. Now, while Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar. Okay, so we've got that right before the crucifixion.
Remind me what version you're using now?
Oh, I slipped into the NRSV. Sorry about that. I'm so sorry.
Did I do that?
It's too early to be laughing this hard, Chris. Oh, man, I needed that. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. So we get the story. We're going to kind of just fly over it a little bit. We might go deeper into some parts. So the woman who anoints Jesus, okay? And then Judas Iscariot says, how much will you pay me to betray Jesus? We get the Last Supper. Okay. We get kingdom language at the end of the original Eucharist here. Tonight you will all desert me, for the scriptures say, God will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. This very night, okay. So they go through praying together. Jesus is arrested. I want to get to the actual crucifixion here. Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot going on here. It's 27, man.
Yeah.
We were wrong.
7:32.
Yeah. Along the way, they came across a man named Simon who was from Cyrene. The soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross, and they went out to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And the soldiers gave Jesus wine mixed with bitter gall, and when he had tasted it, he refused to drink it. We talked about this in Acts class. What's the significance of that for a Jew? Nazarites. You remember what was written on the cross? Jesus the Nazarite? Okay, I made an argument for that in Acts class. A Nazarite doesn't drink wine until his vow is complete. Number 6, I think it is. And so that's my theory for why this is significant theologically in Matthew. After they had nailed him to the cross, the soldiers gambled for his clothes, throwing a dice. And there's a citation here, okay, for Psalm 22:18. They divided my garments among themselves and cast lots for it. So it's very, very Old Testament-y. Then they sat around and kept guard. In other words, he's drawing out the Jewish intonations of the cross. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on his right, one on his left. The people passed and shouted. And by the way, the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC involved revolutionaries. So that's where Hanukkah came from. So that could be an emphasis there. The leading priests, the teachers of the law, the elders, save yourself. Are you really the king of Israel? Okay, then it says, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus called out in a loud voice. Now, why is 3 o'clock significant? In Passover tradition, the evening started at sundown. And if you stretch it a little bit, because there's so many people coming to Jerusalem, and you can't sacrifice the Passover until it's time, the day of preparation, they would stretch it. So that the sun goes down around 6, but we'll start at 3. And that's when Jesus was crucified. Some of the bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. Again, a Jewish intonation here. Jesus shouted out, he released his spirit, and the curtain in the sanctuary, we talked about this last week, it was torn in 2. This is the only account where it says that the curtain temple was torn in. The curtain of the sanctuary in the temple was torn from top to bottom. It says the earth shook, rocks split apart, and tombs opened. The bodies of many godly men and women who had died were raised from the dead. Now, is that in another gospel? No, it is not. They left the cemetery after Jesus' resurrection, went into the holy city of Jerusalem, and appeared to many people. Did that literally happen? So I want to teach you a word called historiography. We talked about this a little bit. It's how you do history. I get to use big words and digging deep. I can't do this on Sunday morning. Historiography is how you view history. So a 21st century historiography says, like, we really have to get it nailed down scientifically. If you read this from a 21st century point of view, you're going to say, well, he said it happened, and he gave us the timing of how it happened, so it had to have happened that way. And what I would want to do is invite you into a first century historiography, which wasn't pure history in the sense of science. The point of history was like reading the great men of Rome. Now we know that these are credible sources, but they took on Greco-Roman biographies as a way of writing. And the point of reading a biography in antiquity was so that you could be like them. You could be like the hero of the story. So was this literal, or was it apocalyptic? Was this saying metaphorically that the earth shook, the rocks split apart, and tombs were opened, because Jesus' death broke the bounds of death and actually conquered death so that we could live again. That's my understanding of it. And the reason for that is because, number one, Matthew is not just writing history, he's writing theology. Number two, Matthew is apocalyptic because Jesus was meaning not the end of time, but things are crazy. No one knows what to expect. It's turned upside down, and Jesus actually is taking the end of time and punctuating history itself. And so it's actually Matthew's way of talking about the implications of Jesus' death on a theological level. And so if you have a certain historiography of saying, well, if he says it at face value, then that's exactly what physically happened. Like if you had a video camera, you could have seen the tombs open and dead people come. But he can be talking without doing injustice to history on a theological level, and it can still be true. Okay? You may not think it's valid, but it is. Yeah, Eric.
So is it possible what he's saying is after Jesus' resurrection, the dead came to life and then began sharing the gospel in Jerusalem after that?
Say that one, the last part.
That the dead, meaning all of us in a sense,
Yeah.
before Christ, now after the resurrection, they
Yeah.
go back into the city and start sharing the gospel.
Yeah, in other words, you know how when you read Revelation, there's symbols? We call it apocalyptic. Matthew, I believe, is writing apocalyptically so that the earth shook, the rocks split apart, and tombs opened metaphorically. The bodies of many godly men who had died were raised from the dead. There's no other record anywhere of that actually happening.
Why does he follow that up with the soldiers were terrified of the earthquake and all that was happening?
Yeah, good question. So let me get there. Let me just follow the text. So they left the cemetery after Jesus' resurrection. They left the cemetery of their previous life of death and went into the holy city of Jerusalem and appeared to many people. Then the Roman soldier and the others were terrified by the earthquake. Now here's the wild part. There could have been an actual earthquake. I don't see it being incongruent. Again, we have a certain way of saying, well, it either literally happened or it was metaphor. And it could be both. Okay? Again, you've got to really say, I've got a certain way of seeing it. We've had the Industrial Revolution, the scientific. We have AI now. Like, they didn't even have computers, let alone the internet. Like, the way we see the world is complete. I thought about, we have autonomous vehicles called cars. Emma asked the other day, like, when the power goes out, do cars still work? And I was like, you know, that's actually kind of incredible. They do. Like, our way of seeing the world is just so utterly different. So it's something to go deeper into and ask. So that's part of the way Matthew talks.
I was going to say on the Roman officer, if you think about what Rome represents, this could be a parallel to all knees will bow. So that, what Rome represents of the world are now bowing to King Jesus.
And you could even think the tombs were open. The bodies of godly men and women who had died were raised from the dead. It could be they were like dead men walking, and they were raised to the newness of life. That is not far-fetched. Yeah. And many women who had come to Galilee with Jesus to care for him were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of James and John, the sons of, there was lots of Marys in the day. Okay, so let's just pause there, and now we'll go to Mark. Mark 15, okay. Crucify him. Okay, a passerby named Simon, who was from Cyrene, was coming in from the countryside just then, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. Okay? Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Okay, that's a detail we didn't get in Matthew. And they brought him to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. They offered him wine drugged with myrrh, but he refused it. Then the soldiers nailed him to the cross. They divided his clothes, threw dice to decide who would get each piece. So we don't find the scriptural reference there. The funny thing is we're kind of reading harmonically by doing this. I just realized. But my point is, there's just a slight difference. What I'm trying to do is bring out the nuances of each.
Mine does have a footnote that they were casting lots, like to the reference
Yeah.
of Psalm 22 as well.
Matthew emphasizes, though, the actual. Here, let's go back to that. Yeah, it is the same. You're right. Mark 15. Okay. So again, the difference is we're trying to hear their distinct sound. We're not trying to get a pure account of one thing. Okay. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. A sign announced the charge against him. It read, "The King of the Jews." 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him. So that's also speaking Gentile language. One on his right, one on his left. Save yourself, the leading priest. He saved others, but can he save him? So it's, again, same story. It says, at noon, darkness fell until 3 o'clock. And then at 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Some bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. Okay? We saw that in Matthew 2. He cried out in a loud breath and breathed his last. Okay, I was wrong about the temple. The curtain, it says, Mark says the curtain was torn in two as well. But we don't get that other detail. And then it says, when the Roman officer who was facing him, so in Matthew there was Roman officers, and here it's one. Saw how he died and exclaimed, this truly is. Did I get that right? Okay. So those are very similar.
In Matthew, they proclaimed that after they were terrified from the earthquake.
Mm-hmm. The earthquake is in Matthew. So let's say you're teaching Matthew, okay? You can emphasize some of the Jewishness of it because that's what he's doing. And when you're reading through Mark, you can do the short version like Mark is doing, and you don't have to get into all the Jewish stuff. Do what the thing you're teaching or preaching is doing. Okay, so if you're teaching the Psalms, for example, there should be emotion involved. Not necessarily contrived, but like you should be aware more uniquely on the emotional side of what you're teaching. I was just, with my company, we do a little Bible study every Thursday at the beginning of our meetings, and I was going through Ephesians 6. And I was like, man, like he's talking about spiritual battle. And so like I talked about spiritual battle with my team. You know what I mean? If you're reading a gospel and they have a certain emphasis, go there with it. That's what I'm saying. Spend your time doing that instead of harmonizing on a technical level. Find out what that person is saying and really understand it. Okay, so we'll go to Luke now. Luke 23.
Quick question.
Is it 24? It's a little before that. Yes.
Which curtain of the temple was torn?
I don't know. I always thought it was between the inner sanctuary.
Because that one would be visible for everybody to see.
Well, if it was the inner one, I'm sure that word would spread pretty fast.
I don't know which one it was. But that's an interesting question. I've never heard an argument that it was anything other than the inner sanctuary.
It would have to be after his resurrection that the inner one would be open, right? For us to enter
Well, I mean, dividing up the cross and the resurrection is really only something that happened later in church history. The passion event is really more like one thing. You know, it's kind of like, well, how did he defeat death with death? Wasn't that what he did with the resurrection? But that's kind of like even separating Good Friday from Easter didn't happen early. Like they were together for the first few centuries. You would celebrate them at the same time. So the analogy is the gospel message of Jesus is like pure light that goes through a prism, and over time it was refracted into the different colors. And so we look at the different colors now, and we kind of do like, you know, Good Friday, and like, we don't do any others except for Easter, but other traditions have like the different days of the week, and you splice it out, and then we've got the Ascension. But it's really just one pure light. You can refract it, and that's helpful to know because sometimes you're like, well, what did the cross do exactly? The cross is inseparable from the resurrection on one level. So that's my response. Okay, this is Luke 23:26. As they led Jesus away, a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, so we don't get more background on him like the others had. They happened to be coming in from the countryside. The soldiers seized him and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large crowd trailed behind with a grief-stricken woman. And then we get this. So if you're teaching in Matthew, don't jump over to Luke to talk about the daughters of Jerusalem. Don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children, for the days are coming, okay? Fall on us, bury us. I don't know why he emphasizes that. Two others, both criminals. So we saw revolutionaries, but Luke says criminals. So don't go over and talk about revolutionaries. Use Luke's language and understand, okay, so what are the criminals here? What's the difference? Let's do some instant details here.
So I'll give a little nugget that I learned when I was in Israel with Bobby. Jim Fleming led that trip, and he said, most translations say thieves on the cross. He says that's inaccurate, that they would have actually been Jewish zealots, because the penalty for theft would have been the cutting off of hands.
Yeah.
Crucifixion, the penalty for being a zealot.
Yeah, so the word revolutionary in Matthew and Mark is leistai. That's the plural of revolutionary. Here, it's kakuragoi. He uses a different word. This is broader for criminal. They just did something wrong. But Matthew and Mark emphasize that they were bandits. They didn't just steal, but they were violent as well. And that's what a zealot was. A zealot would be not just kind of generically stealing, but like violently. Okay?
Jim Fleming emphasized when he was teaching us that a big portion of that was their refusal to pay Roman taxes.
So why might Luke be just saying criminals? If he's thinking more evangelistically, more globally, revolutionary might have been more about the temple and Jerusalem life. So you wouldn't necessarily emphasize the zealot if you're teaching from Luke, you wouldn't really emphasize the zealot nature and the Jewish background. You would do what Luke is doing, which is be generic about it. That's how you can read symphonically. They were led out to the place called the Skull. He doesn't talk about Golgotha. That's interesting. The criminals were also crucified. One is right. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. So if you're preaching Matthew or Luke, teaching from those, don't talk about this verse in Luke. Sorry, if you're teaching Matthew or Mark, don't do this verse from Luke. In other words, you've heard the 7 sayings of the cross. Don't do that.
Because that comes from the harmony.
Here's why. Because if God wanted that, he would have written one gospel and been like, And here they all are in a row. I believe the inspiration of Scripture is so divine that he made it distinct. So I want you to honor God's word by treating it as such. So when you're doing Luke, and this is also a really practical way. Like, let's say you're reading strategically through the Bible. Well, you could do one gospel this year with the youth group, one gospel the next year, and and you could bring out the different emphases naturally as you go. That's a practical way of thinking about it. We could also talk about 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings. Like, there's overlap, there's harmonies there too, or you could read it symphonically. Father, forgive them. The crowd watched and save others. God's Messiah, the chosen one. Save yourself, King of the Jews. Okay. And then we find out what the criminals said. Don't you fear God? We deserve to die for our crimes, but this man has done nothing wrong. That's unique here. And this is where we get that line, you'll be with me in paradise. So what could Luke be doing uniquely? Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing, couched with a guy who does know what he did. Jesus is showing forgiveness in a unique way. And so by honoring Luke and looking at that in context, you can actually just say, oh, Luke is doing something with forgiveness here that's unique. Let's do that. And the reason you don't want to preach or teach Matthew, Mark, and Luke together, and you're kind of in the text of Matthew, but you jump over and you grab Luke 23:34 and you put it back over here, is because you lose the unique sound of the timpani of forgiveness in Luke, because you've just cherry-picked one part of it out of context over here for your own devices. Okay? Again, it's not like sinful to do that, but we're trying to honor God with everything, and I think that this is a way we can do that. By the time it was noon, the darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Okay, the light of the sun was gone. I was just dead wrong about the curtain. It's in all three, man. I love it when I'm like, yep, okay, wrong about that. Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. I told you I was pushing the limits. Apparently my ceiling is not very high.
So along those lines, let me ask, like the miracles, when Jesus fed the 5,000, that's in all four gospels, so everybody says, oh, that's super important. So when you see something like the curtain being torn and three of the, I'm assuming 3 of the 4.
It is, I don't think it's in John.
So do you view...
But, I mean, we'll find out.
So
I do know John a little better.
Yeah, so do you view an event like that worthy of additional study, or is more important, or,
That's a good question. I would probably say it the opposite, that you should draw more attention to when it's only in one. I think you could see it both ways. Now, we know that Jesus predicted his death 3 times in each of the 3 synoptic gospels. That's a cool fact. Does that help? Yeah, kind of. It's just helpful to remember that he did that. But what good does that do other than make you sound smart? Not much. I don't think it adds a lot of value. That's my opinion.
So you're saying maybe focus on the differences than on the similarity?
No, I mean, it's an art, right? Like when you think about a symphony, it's beautiful. And what I'm trying to do is help us to hear the beauty of the gospel. That's all. I'm not trying to say there's only one way to do it. I'm just trying to say there's more to it than maybe we thought. That's it. And I want you to do it too, so that other people can hear it.
When you're listening to a symphony for the first time, you take the whole piece in. You can't focus on one part, or at least you should, in my opinion. And then you can go back and listen to the violins and notice, like your son did, those little details, right? And that's what I'm thinking about is, going back and after you've read maybe all the gospels to get a familiarity with it, you can go and you can pick up the subtle differences in the gospel. And if something is in all 4, well then, maybe we know that happened. But I'm just thinking thinking of, I've lost the thought, just go ahead.
I appreciate you processing that.
It's
The
gonna
whole
make
thing.
it's gonna make sense to me. It's like the ones that are repeated in each gospel. It's like that can be kind of core. But if you're trying to understand exactly what each gospel is saying, the outlier story is gonna give you a better grasp of what they're trying to show in their gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm not saying don't listen to them together. We're doing that very thing this morning. What I'm trying to say is learn to hear them individually. Learn to hear that in the background, you know. That was so funny when he said that. Says, when the Roman officer, Luke 23:47, overseeing the execution, saw what had happened, he worshipped God and said, surely this man was innocent. Now that's interesting. He's innocent, not the Son of God. Or is that saying the same thing? What did he actually say, Chad? A harmonized approach, historicism that's scientifically focused would try and answer that question. And what I'm saying is don't worry about that. Part of the beauty of reading symphonically is you don't have to figure it out. Just take it at face value and trust that God is saying something important.
That word innocent is translated righteous. So in a sense, like it didn't say the Son of God, but I think it's deeper than just innocent of a crime. Like it was.
And you're speaking theologically now, which is good.
Okay.
Yeah. So what you could do with the symphonic approach is say Son of God in these others, and the way Luke understands Son of God, or the way Matthew and Mark understand innocent, means the other as well. In other words, there's a deeper meaning. So you could read it at face value, like, okay, the Roman officer believes. Okay, let's preach about conversion. Let's preach about radical conversions. And it's like, well, what about the notion of innocence? Let's talk about that when we read Luke. Don't worry about the messianic meaning of Son of God when you're teaching Luke. Focus on what Luke is saying. Don't worry about, well, what did the historical Roman centurion actually say? Just say what Luke said, because that's what you're doing. It's simpler. Okay? And when all the crowd that came to see the crucifixion saw what had happened, they went home in deep sorrow, but Jesus' friends followed him. They stood watching. Okay. So I hope that exercise is helpful. Let's go to John, and the BBC World News of the Gospels. So they took Jesus away. Carrying the cross by himself, he went to the place of the skull. In Hebrew, Golgotha. So he designates what it is. They nailed him to the cross. 2 others were crucified with him. If there is a temple curtain in here, I'm going to be mad. They nailed him to the cross. 2 others were crucified with him. Jesus in between. Pilate posted a sign on the cross that read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. We hadn't come across that yet, had we? So when you're preaching from Luke and Matthew and Mark, don't talk about this. Save it for when you do John 19. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. We talked about that. If you missed it, then go, was it Acts class? Yeah, go watch Acts class. The place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so that many people could read it. And the leading priest objected, change it from King of the Jews to, he said, I'm King of the Jews. And Pilate's like, there's not enough space, dude. We already wrote it.
Always worried about the
Pilate replied, no, what I have written, I have written. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they divided his clothes among the 4 of them. John does some interesting number stuff. That's something to inquire about, is why 4? Why does that matter to John? They also took his robe. Okay, we've got some clothes here. But this one is seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Now, why does that matter to John and not the synoptics? Why is this a spiritual gospel? Holiness? Wholeness. John has a motif of wholeness that's associated with holiness. And who else wore a seamless one-piece tunic in Jewish tradition? The high priest. John is doing something about Jesus as the high priest. Rather than tearing it apart, they threw dice. So it's emphasizing the wholeness. And this signifies that Jesus was whole, he was the high priest, and he brings wholeness to us, theologically speaking. And it comes back to, they divided my garments through dice. Excuse me. Standing near the cross were Jesus' mother. What? Okay. What is John saying? And his mother's sister, Mary. Look, come on, Marys. And Mary, it's like Mary, Mary, and Mary. Goodness.
They had like 12 names back then.
But that's why they said the wife of Cleopas and Mary Magdalene, you know. When Jesus saw his mother standing there beside the disciple he loved, he said, "Dear woman, here's your son." And he said to this disciple, "Here is your mother." And from then on, this disciple took her into his home. This is a conundrum to think through. Was Jesus doing the Jewish thing and making sure that his mom was taken care of? Well, the implication is that Joseph was dead. I think that's pretty solid ground. There's also an early tradition that when Joseph had been married before and his wife died, and he had James before he got married to Mary. So that makes sense. There's no reason to discredit that. It's not biblical, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. Joseph may have been an older man, married Mary when she was young to help him raise his existing kid or kids, because Jesus had brothers and sisters, right? How did all that work? Well, that's interesting. But it could have been that Joseph died of old age when Jesus was still a young man. That's a plausible explanation, and there is some tradition that points to that. Either way, looks like Mary's a widow. And so is Jesus saying, here is your son? Meaning, like, take care of this lady because I'm dying and I'm doing my duty as kind of the oldest or as the man of the family kind of thing? Or is this a theological statement? Or is it both? And if John did both, it would be par for the course for him, because he loves the double entendre. In John 3, for example, he says, the Spirit's like the wind. It blows wherever it wants. You know, you must be born again. Born again or born above? And Nicodemus is like, which one are you talking about? And then in John 13, Peter's like, wait, do you mean literally wash? Because then wash my whole body. He's like, no, I mean metaphorically and literally. And Peter's like, what?
It's simple.
What is he doing here with and we don't know, the disciple whom Jesus loved is the author of John. But what if we take it at face value and it's the beloved disciple quintessential? And Jesus is saying to Mary, Jesus' mother, who represents the church, here's your son. And he breathes his last breath. He's saying, in a sense, this could be one interpretation. Here is now me with you. Don't grieve, because I'm still with you. As the beloved disciple. We become the body of Christ, don't we? Paul's very clear about that. What if John is doing something theologically primarily here? And actually saying, we are now Christ, the beloved disciple. And Mary, the church, is now one with Jesus, which is what he prays for in John 17. And he says, here's your mother. And then he took her into his home. Again, could be literal and theological at the same time, especially in John 14. He says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. There's many rooms. What if he's speaking on two levels at the same time? By letting John speak, sometimes there's not enough time to teach. If you're doing a smattering of different gospels, what John is uniquely doing, drawing out John 3, John 14, John 17 to interpret John 19. You see what I'm saying? There's not enough time if you're going to read symphonically to do a harmonic reading at the same time. You guys tracking?
So yes, sir.
Thank you.
So who is my mother, my brother, and my sister? Those who do the will of God. So
Yeah.
at that point, his family hadn't converted yet. So is he possibly saying, okay, church family is above family here,
Yep.
and I need you to take care of mine?
I think John could be doing the same thing that was it Matthew or Luke does when Jesus' brothers and sisters were coming, and he's like, anyone who does the will of my Father is my mother and my brother and my sister. Yep.
So, just to make this clear, you're not saying that John is recording something that didn't actually happen. Jesus said exactly what you read. He recorded it. And we're thinking the Holy Spirit inspired all this, that choice of words, so that we could apply it on a deeper level, like the church, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so we don't know exactly what was said. We have a record of what was said, and it was interpreted. It was true. Okay? In the same way that the tombs broke open is true, this is what Jesus said.
So much to learn.
Yeah.
I mean, the like criminal revolutionary one is a really easy one.
That's a
because-
great example, yeah.
because the revolutionary, that means way more to the Jews who had just been through like hundreds of years of, waiting for the Messiah and revolutionaries. But then, none of that matters to anybody outside of the Jews really. So it's just general criminality, and the entire language of the rest of the gospel changes, but it doesn't necessarily change 100% the intent. And I keep thinking of Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, where he mentions that, like, if you have eyewitnesses reports, it's actually fishy if multiple eyewitness reports line up 100%, because it seems like people are coordinating their responses at that point.
Yep.
Anyway.
So I wanted to promote that kind of reading of the Gospels. We keep going. I mean, Jesus says, I'm thirsty, it is finished. Just do John. Don't do the 7 sayings of the cross. Just do John's sayings of the cross. Let him speak. In other words, it'd be like splice. Have you seen those videos? It'll be like Donald Trump, and it'll be different. It'll be like little snippets of Donald Trump from all his speeches saying something that he didn't mean. That's the danger of doing a harmonic approach. Is when you kind of just cherry pick different things from different scriptures, you're making a mosaic of your own creation. God's already written the word as he wants it to flow. So let's preach and teach symphonically. There's been a lot of damage, I think, with cherry picking scriptures out of context. Now, you can do it. You can piece scriptures together, but only if you've learned to play each individual instrument. Otherwise, it sounds like a trash can band in a garage, and it's ugly, and no one would call that beautiful. I want you to sound scripture beautifully. It takes a lot of work. And if you're a junior, if you're a novice, be a junior or a novice. Don't act like you're a Mozart. It's okay to be a novice, but don't pretend you're something else. That's my...
So are you really saying, or what I'm hearing is that harmonically can sometimes be more about accuracy, like, okay, we need to make sure and be very accurate about what was said here, and you kind of miss the point.
Yeah, it can be accuracy, but a faux accuracy. You're making up what you think is accurate.
There you go.
You don't know how did it actually work? That's a historicist view where that's your primary lens. Again, history's good. But the primary lens, I think you can make a very strong argument, of the apostolic writers is theological. And the fact that they have differences shows you that they're not going scientific, they're going theological. And by the way, think about the real people in your life. Think about your kids. Do they really need science to convert them to Christ?
Heck no.
What happened before the scientific revolution? They couldn't have converted. Theology transcends all of time.
Let's go.
And it hits people in the chest. Think about Luke 24. What hit them in the chest? They had all the facts. They had all the data. It was experiencing the symphonic retelling of the gospel. Because, by the way, all things are gospel when they're seen through the lens of Christ in Scripture. That's a whole nother thing we talked about in the Old Testament. But when it hits you in the chest and your heart burns and you experience Christ, the crucified and risen one, that's when you create disciples that don't go back. You can fill their head and they'll easily apostatize. But if you allow God to fill their hearts, there ain't no going back. You won't be able to stop the disciples you make. They will be unstoppable for the next generation. But if we do this scientific approach only, if we do the data says, the history is, the manuscripts, the early codices and all this stuff, look, Wes Huff is great. He's got all that kind of stuff. That's fine. But it's elementary, and it's not full. And you could make disciples who are basing their faith on history. Well, guess what's going to happen next? A new historical document's going to mess with what we thought was history, and then we have to reevaluate, and all of a sudden we're deconstructing. People are leaving the faith because we tried to make the text do something it wasn't doing. Let's let God's word be God's word and let it sound symphonically. And that's the reason is because that's what we've been given. Why are we trying to construct things in a way that we weren't given? You see what I'm saying?
I really don't want to make you late, but I just want to echo what like the young man on the other side was saying. You read these.
Brad, young man. Whoa.
Wow. Congratulations.
It's all relative. So, but I agree with everything you said. But now my brain is overwhelmed with history. You got N.T. Wright in this book, tons of history.
Well, that's why.
Paul book,
Yeah,
tons
that's
of
why.
history.
Here's the deal. We live in a historical age. That's why I had you read those books. When I teach, I assign books that are saying things that I'm not saying, because you need to be balanced out.
Now you tell me.
No, seriously. Oh, Austin. Dude, I like you already. We're just getting into...
I took Chad's implied 5-book challenge.
No, I did not challenge anyone, David. You're the only one who takes up that challenge. Every class, he's like, I read all of them. I'm like, I never asked you to do that.
Okay, so say anything about history?
We live in a historical age. I want you to be able to speak the language of our age. But what I want you to know is that it's not the ultimate. N.T. Wright was solving a problem of his age. There were people in the 70s threatening the Gospels, and he said, oh man, they were saying the Bible's not accurate. And he was like, well, I'm going to take up that challenge. He will claim he's primarily a historian. That's fine. We need historians. It's good. The Paul book, offers great history, but not everyone needs to be a historian.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So really what you're that the way you approach it, but know that that can be a bias and that you may be missing part of it if this is the only way that you approach it.
Yeah, don't be a one-trick pony. That's all I'm saying. Like, have multiple tools in your tool belt, and then know which ones you should use every day, and which ones you should use once a month. Mm-hmm. Cool. I was in construction for 3 months. Okay. And then I realized I had carpal tunnel and could not make a career out of it. So, okay. So I'm going to balance my own self out now. This is for you. You can also read the text too narrowly. If you only sound the violin, it's like stop, like we need more. So you can err on the side of just reading Matthew and like just focusing on the details of the text. Okay, so here's an example. Matthew 20, verses 1 to 6. For the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay the normal daily wage and sent them out to work. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace and saw some people standing around doing nothing. So he hired them, telling them that he would pay them for whatever was right at the end of the day. So they went to work in the vineyard. At noon, and again at 3 o'clock, he did the same thing. Okay, so here's the numbers. What are the numbers? Someone read them to me. 9. Okay. So 9, which is 3 o'clock in antiquity. Okay, so the day starts at 6 a.m. The first hour is 7 a.m. So we're going to transpose this. In other words, they've already translated it. In Greek, it was the third hour. Okay, what's the other one? 9 o'clock in the noon is the 6th hour. And then, okay, 9th hour, yeah, okay. And then the 11th hour is 5 o'clock. Okay? Says, and then at 5 o'clock that afternoon, which in the original language they said is the 11th hour, okay, because there's 12 hours in a day. He was in town again and saw that some people were standing around. 12 hours in like the daylight hours. Why haven't you been working? They said, because no one hired us. He said, go join the others. That evening he told the farmer, okay, and he paid them all the same. And so Jesus has this whole story, okay? And the story, by the way, it ends in this truism from Jesus: those who are last will be first, and those who are first will be last. And he was doing something in Matthew to talk about how the Jews thought that they were first. And he's like, well, actually, you're going to be last, and the people who you thought were last, which were the Gentiles, are now first. That was his point. But here's what you can do if you get real weird about reading narrowly. You can hyper-focus on the details and miss the forest. So this is true. This is what Irenaeus talks about this in book 1 of Against the Heresies, the one I said that's hard to get through. So he articulates how the heretics of the 2nd century used this parable to talk about the pleroma. Okay? The pleroma is a Greek word for fullness. In Colossians 2, 9 and 10, it says, for the fullness of the deity dwelled in bodily form in Jesus, okay? It's a very biblical term, but here's what the heretics did with that. They're like, pleroma, okay, let's get a little weird. And let's say that there's 30 members in the pleroma. So this is real Christians in the 2nd century. And what they said is, there's some weird stuff, like there's evil in the world and creation's kind of bad. So we're gonna divide God up into 30 parts. Now they're all one. It's called the pleroma. But like the creator God, the proarche, the propater, the bethus, which means depth, that's a different creator, because we know that was more like a demiurge. The mythology of the ancient Greeks tells us about that. So there's some truth there, but then from that, we get charis, which means grace, and nous, which means mind. So they divide God up into these different parts. Aletheia means truth, and logos, word, and zoe, life. They literally created a mythology around who God was to help people understand God. And here's what they did. They said, well, in this parable, we've got 3 and 6 and 9 and 11, which if you add them together equals 30, which supports the pleroma. Let's see.
Must be a 1 in there somewhere.
Let's see. Let's redo the math. I trusted you. Does it say first hour?
Does he say first hour?
Let's go back. This is why you don't switch to the NIV.
Early in the morning, when it was 9 o'clock, went out again.
Let's do this.
Like,
No. So it's 1. What they did is, and we'd have to go to the passage to see how they did it, but they had a 1 in there. I think it's like the first hour. I don't know. But this is what they did. And they said it equals 30, so that supports the pleroma because there's 30. And Jesus was 30 when he started his ministry. And they actually did these tricks, and it worked with people. But what they were doing is dividing God up into his constituent parts. When I ask my kids, what do you like about school today? Or actually they don't really like school as much. What did you like about SOAR? Like I took Emma to SOAR. Nothing, I just liked it. Kids actually have this purity of heart that doesn't divide things into its constituent parts. So I've let my kids just say, I just liked it. That's actually admirable. These are all theological terms. Henosis is oneness. Ecclesia means church. Anthropos means man. They created this mythology around it, but here's the deal. Are we really that far and separate from doing that today? What is Elon Musk's true north? Who knows?
He wants everyone to have a brain implant.
No, that's not his true north. That's an implication of it. What is Elon Musk's true north? What is his whole life about? Why did he buy X? Truth. Now, is it God's truth as expressed in Jesus? No. It's deified truth, where it's actually divine to him. That is his ultimate allegiance. So in Platonism, there was forms of things on earth that represented the reality that transcended the concrete forms of what we see. I was going to draw with this, but so think of it like there's these emanations. So there's the unity of God, you could call it. But then there's these emanations that come down. You could call this one truth. And you could call this one, I've got some others on here, reason. They're instances of the transcendent. And so we find, for Elon Musk, X was a way to really have a truthful, open forum. For Jordan Peterson, you could say that his true north is reason or order. Well, the word for that is logos, by the way, which is one of the aeons of the pleroma from 2nd century Gnosticism, which was heretical. And so Jordan Peterson, it's like, are you a Christian? I'm actually glad he doesn't say he's a Christian because I'm not convinced that he is Orthodox. Oh, he's a Christian, all right, because he associates with the name of Christ. But I firmly believe that he's got something up his sleeve that might be damning for him. And it's his fixation on the ideas of the gospel that they come from God, but they're distinct from God, and it's kind of creating a theology out of these fixations on ideas or emanations. In other words, it's dividing God into his parts. And the problem is when truth is over here, but it's not integrated with reason, and it's not instantiated by the Son of God as ultimate truth, then you get weird. Then you get some weird theosophy, which is theology and wisdom mixed in together, and then you create your own religion, and it's called heresy. And you can ground it in Scripture in all sorts of ways, which is exactly what Jordan Peterson does. So he's got a book, We Who Wrestle with God. I want to read it just to kind of dig down into it. But if you ask him, did Jesus bodily raise from the dead? He's like, what do you mean by raise from the dead? Yes. Now, you could be like, well, Chad, didn't you do that exact same thing when we talked about Luke? Well, there's some lines in the sand where it is important, okay? And the bodily resurrection of Jesus, we know from 1 Corinthians 15, is not just symbolic. It is also physical and real. So there are lines in the sand. There's a whole, we could talk for days and days about what I brought up here. I just kind of want to introduce you to what it looks like to read too narrowly. What you do is you end up, instead of cherry picking and putting them together, you just cherry pick one idea and bring it into a whole new field called psychology. And you do the psychologization of theology, and then all of a sudden you're using Scripture, but you're cherry picking it and imposing it into your existing Freudian or Jungian psychology, and all of a sudden you've potentially damned yourself with your own wisdom, and you've said, well, it's in the Bible. So that's the danger of reading too narrowly. We were going to talk about Paul's life today. I'm kind of glad we didn't. I think this was the right thing to do. So we're going to pick up Paul, and we're going to spend a week or two just going through his letters, and then we'll do the general epistles after that. But we've got just a couple minutes. Any questions? I know that it's been a lot. It's hopefully been challenging, but maybe even relieving. Any questions or comments to end us out? If there's accusations, just bring them to Bobby. He's fully aware. Questions? I think that's all we got for today, so we'll see you guys next week.